The fire took the house on a Tuesday, and by Friday my son was gone too, and the police told me both facts, as if they were unrelated. I stood in the parking lot of the sheriff's substation, with the ashes of 40 years still in my throat, and Detective Ramos looked at me the way you look at an old man who has lost the thread. He said Daniel was an adult. He said adults leave. He said there was no evidence of foul play, only a burned-out farmhouse and a grown man who had every reason to run. But I had heard the phone call, 3 nights before the fire, through the thin wall of the guest room where I was staying. I heard my son say 7 words I would never forget. He said, "If he finds the second ledger, we're done." Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The town, the state, the country. I read every one of them. And if stories about family, about loyalty, and about the quiet cost of being underestimated mean something to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know. To understand how a burned house and a missing son and a stranger's voice all became one story, you have to go back to the beginning, to the spring, before any of it happened, when I still believed the worst thing in my life was already behind me. My name is Nathaniel Reyes. I am 71 years old, and for 38 of those years, I was a fire investigator for the state, a cause and origin man, the person they sent in after the flames were out, to read the burn, the way other people read a book. I could stand in a gutted room and tell you where a fire was born, how fast it grew, what it fed on, and whether a human hand had helped it along. I spent my whole life learning the grammar of ash. I never once imagined I would have to read my own house that way. My wife's name was Rosalind. We were married for 44 years. She was a high school chemistry teacher, the kind of teacher whose students came back 20 years later to tell her she was the reason they became nurses and engineers, and one, memorably, an arson investigator like her husband. Rosalind had a laugh that filled a room and a mind like a steel trap, and when the cancer took her 3 years ago, it took the loudest, warmest part of my world and left a silence I still have not gotten used to. We had one son, Daniel. He came late, when Rosalind was almost 40, and we loved him with the particular fierceness of parents who thought they'd never get the chance. Daniel was clever and charming and restless. He was the kind of boy who could talk his way out of any trouble, and, later, the kind of man who could talk his way into any room. He went into commercial real estate development, and for a while he did well, or seemed to. Nice suits, nicer car, a house up in the hills with a view. He married a woman named Priscilla 11 years ago. I want to be fair to her, even now, so I will only tell you what I saw. Priscilla was polished and precise, and she watched people the way I watch a fire, always looking for the point of origin, the weakness, the place where a little pressure would bring the whole structure down. From the first dinner I sensed she had done the arithmetic on Rosalind and me. 2 aging parents, 1 paid-off farmhouse on 11 acres, a pension, savings. She smiled at us, and I could see her carrying the numbers. After Rosalind died, I sold the big house we'd raised Daniel in, and I moved out to the farmhouse full-time. It had been our weekend place for 20 years. A solid old 2-story, with a wraparound porch, a wood stove, and a workshop out back, where I kept my tools and my files. 11 acres of oak and dry grass, a well, a long gravel drive. It was the last thing Rosalind and I built together, and I meant to die there, slowly, quietly, decades from now. I did not know that other people had already decided how the farmhouse would end. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with money that was mine, that other people had begun to think of as theirs. About 8 months before the fire, Daniel came to me with a proposal. He sat at my kitchen table, turning his coffee cup in slow circles, and he told me he had a development opportunity that was, In his words, once in a lifetime. A commercial parcel, an anchor tenant already lined up, permits nearly through. He needed short-term capital. Bridge financing, he called it. 6 months, maybe 8. And then the construction loan would fund, and everyone would be paid back with interest. He needed $400,000. I had it. Between the sale of the old house, our savings, and Rosalind's life insurance, I had a little over $600,000 set aside, most of it in a brokerage account I rarely touched. $400,000 was most of it. But it was my son, and he was sitting at the table Rosalind and I had eaten breakfast at for 2 decades, and he had her eyes, and he said, "Please, Dad, I wouldn't ask if it weren't real." I asked him to put it in writing. That is the one thing my career taught me above all else, that memory lies, and paper doesn't. Daniel laughed, a little too quickly, and said, Of course. He'd have his attorney draw up a promissory note. He did. It came a week later, and it was real, and it was properly executed, and I signed my $400,000 away to my only child, and I felt, God help me, proud that he had come to me. For a while, everything seemed fine. Daniel would call with updates. The steel was ordered. The tenant had signed. Priscilla sent me a photo of an architectural rendering, all glass and clean lines, and wrote underneath it, "Your grandkids' college fund. Thanks, Nathaniel." With a little heart. I don't have grandchildren. I noticed that. I filed it away and said nothing. Then, about 3 months before the fire, the calls changed. They got shorter, vaguer. When I asked specific questions, which bank, what draw schedule, when does the construction loan close, Daniel got irritated in a way he never used to. He told me not to worry about the details. He told me I wouldn't understand the financing structure. This from a boy I taught to balance a checkbook. I have spent my life being told by nervous people not to worry about the details, usually while standing in the smoking ruin of something they insisted was an accident. I know what that tone means. It means someone is managing me. So I did what I have always done. I started paying attention. I asked Daniel, casually, if I could see the note again. I said I'd misplaced my copy and wanted it for my files. He said he'd send it. He didn't. I asked again. He said Priscilla handled the paperwork, and she was traveling. I let it go. On the surface. Underneath, a small, cold feeling had started. The same feeling I used to get standing in a doorway when the story I was being told didn't match the burn pattern on the wall. Then, in early spring, Daniel asked if he and Priscilla could come stay with me for a while. He said their house was being renovated. He said it would only be a few weeks. He said it would be good, the 3 of us, like old times. And part of me, the lonely part, the part that still set 2 coffee cups out every morning from habit, was glad. I said yes before I'd even thought about it. They arrived on a Sunday, with far more luggage than a few weeks required. I noticed that too. Living with them was the beginning of the end of my innocence about my son. For the first week, I told myself I was imagining things. Priscilla was attentive in a way that felt rehearsed. She started cooking my meals and, I realized later, controlling what I ate and when. She began answering the phone when it rang, even though it was my phone, in my house. She'd say, "Oh, it's just a spam call, Nathaniel," and hang up, and I'd wonder, in the small hours, who had actually been on the line. She started making comments. Little ones, dropped like seeds. She'd say she worried about me out here all alone, so far from town, at my age. She'd say, wasn't I lonely? Wasn't it a lot of house for one man? Wouldn't I be happier somewhere with people my own age, and less to worry about? She said the word worry a great deal. I began to understand that in Priscilla's mouth, worry was a tool. She was building a story, brick by brick, and the story was that Nathaniel Reyes, could no longer take care of himself. I have watched enough investigations to recognize when someone is establishing a narrative for later use. She was documenting my decline before it existed. One evening, I came into the kitchen and heard her on the phone in the pantry, her voice low. I stopped in the hall. She was saying, "No, he's fine. He's just old, he forgets things." And then she saw me and smiled and said into the phone, "I have to go." I asked who that was. She said her sister. I didn't have a way to prove otherwise, but her sister lived in Ohio, and it was 11 at night in Ohio. That was the night I made a decision. I decided to stop being a father who trusted, and to start being an investigator who watched. I did not want to. It felt like a betrayal of Daniel to even consider that he might be part of whatever this was. But 40 years of standing in burned rooms had taught me one merciless lesson. The people who set the fire are almost always the people who had the most to gain, and they are almost always the people the victim loved and refused to suspect. So I started keeping notes. Not on paper in the house. I wasn't a fool. I bought a small pocket notebook in town, and I kept it in the glove box of my truck, and every day I wrote down what I'd seen. Priscilla answered my phone 4 times today. Daniel avoided the question about the construction loan again. There was a man in a gray sedan parked at the end of the drive for 20 minutes this morning. Small things. The kind of details that mean nothing alone and everything together. It's always the pattern, never the single fact. I also started, quietly, to test them. I told Daniel one morning, over coffee, that I'd been thinking about my will, that I wanted to make sure everything was in order, that the farmhouse and my accounts went where they should. I watched his face when I said it. Something flickered. Interest, sharp and quick, gone in an instant. He said that was smart. Dad, real responsible. And did I want him to set up a meeting with an estate attorney he knew? I said maybe. I did not tell him that I had updated my will 8 months earlier. Right after I'd signed away his $400,000. With a lawyer he'd never heard of, in an office 2 counties away. Her name was Elena Cruz. She was sharp and young, and she'd come recommended by an old colleague of mine, a retired assistant district attorney I trusted with my life. When I'd first sat in Elena's office, she'd asked me why I was updating my will, and I'd told her the truth, because I had just given most of my liquid savings to my son, and something in the way he'd asked for it had woken up a part of me I'd spent 40 years training, the investigator part. The part that never fully believes the easy story. Elena had listened, and then she'd said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Mr. Reyes, in my experience, the people who get hurt worst are the ones who see the warning signs and talk themselves out of them, because loving someone feels like it should be enough. Don't talk yourself out of it. Let's just make sure you're protected and hope you never need it." We made sure I was protected, and then I put it out of my mind, until Priscilla started answering my phone in the pantry at 11 at night. Now, living under the same roof as my son and his wife, watching the 2 of them manage me like a problem to be solved, I called Elena from the parking lot of the grocery store where no one could overhear. I told her what was happening. She listened, and then she asked me one question that changed everything. She asked if I still had access to the loan documents Daniel had given me. The promissory note, any records of where the $400,000 had actually gone. I said I had my copy of the note, in the safe in my workshop. She said, "Good, because if your son is in the kind of trouble I think he might be in, that $400,000 didn't go into any development, and you need to find out where it went before anyone else realizes you're looking." That was the beginning of the second thing I started doing in secret. Not just watching them, investigating the money. I want to tell you about the workshop, because it matters. Out behind the farmhouse, past the old oak Rosalind and I planted the year Daniel was born, There's a converted barn I used as my office and shop. 38 years of case files, reference books, tools, a good safe bolted to the concrete floor. It was the one place Priscilla never went. She wrinkled her nose at the dust and the smell of machine oil. And so it became my command post. I moved my notebook there. I set up an old laptop that had never been on the house Wi-Fi, and at night, after they'd gone to bed, I'd walk out across the dark grass with a flashlight, let myself in, and work. The first thing I did was pull my copy of the promissory note, and actually read it the way I should have read it 8 months before, not as a proud father, but as an investigator. And that's when I found the first thing that was wrong. The note referenced a company, Meridian Vale Holdings, LLC. Daniel's development entity, supposedly. The note said my $400,000 was a loan to Meridian Vale for the purpose of the commercial development. Fine, but I'd spent decades pulling business records for arson cases, and I knew how to look up an LLC. So on that old laptop, on a hotspot from a prepaid phone I'd bought with cash, I searched the state's business registry for Meridian Vale Holdings. It existed, but it had been formed only 3 weeks before Daniel asked me for the money. And the registered agent, the person of record, was not Daniel. It was Priscilla. I sat in the workshop at 2 in the morning and looked at my wife's chemistry teacher, handwriting on an old note taped to the wall. She used to leave me notes out there, reminders, little jokes, and I looked at the screen that said my son's wife owned the company that had my $400,000, and I felt the floor of my life tilt, because here's what I knew, that a normal grieving father might not have. A brand new LLC, formed by the spouse and not the borrower, right before an urgent request for cash, is not how legitimate development financing works. That is how you build a box to move money through and hide where it lands. I had seen that exact structure before, testifying in 3 different fraud-adjacent arson cases. I just never thought I'd see it with my own name signed at the bottom. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with it. And in the morning I made myself do the hardest thing, which was to go inside and pour coffee and say good morning to my son and his wife, and smile, while my whole insides had turned to ash. Because I understood now that I was not dealing with a disappointment. I was dealing with a scheme. And the first rule of catching people who set fires is that you never let them see you looking. You let them believe the room is exactly as dumb and slow and trusting as they need it to be. And then you read the burn. So I decided to become exactly the old man Priscilla was telling everyone I was. I started performing. It is a strange thing to deliberately act frail, to make yourself smaller. But I had spent a career watching liars perform for me, and I knew the vocabulary of it, and now I turned it on them. I began to forget things on purpose. I'd ask Priscilla the same question twice in an hour, and watch her exchange a look with Daniel. I'd misplace my reading glasses and make a show of hunting for them while they sat on my head. I'd repeat a story I'd told the day before, and watch her patience, and watch her file it away as evidence. I let them catch me looking confused at the mail. I let Priscilla start paying my household bills to help, which meant I let her into my accounts, which meant I could watch what she did there, and she did exactly what I expected. Within 2 weeks she had suggested, gently, so gently, that maybe it would be easier if I added her as an authorized user on my checking account, just for the bills, just while they were staying here, just to take the worry off my plate. That word again, worry. I said yes. I let her in the front door of my finances, and I made sure she believed I didn't understand what a door was. What she didn't know was that every night I was in the workshop, logged into those same accounts from the outside, watching her movements like footprints in ash. I photographed every statement. I saved every transfer. I built a record. When she moved $6,200 from my checking to an account I didn't recognize, and labeled it Home Repairs. I had a screenshot of it before she'd closed the tab. I learned things in those weeks that I will carry the rest of my life. And I learned them by making myself into a lie, which is a strange and lonely way to live in your own house. Let me tell you what the performance actually cost, because I don't want to make it sound clever or easy. It was neither. Every morning I woke up in the guest room. They had taken the main bedroom, the one Rosalind and I had shared, and I had let them, because a confused old man doesn't fight over rooms. And every morning I had to decide, before my feet hit the floor, exactly how much of myself to hide that day. Too little, and Priscilla would sense the sharpness underneath and start to wonder. Too much, and I'd overplay it, and she'd sense that too, because Priscilla was a performer herself, and one performer can always smell another. So I had to find the exact register of a real man declining, and I had to hold it for 16 hours a day, and then walk out across the dark grass at night, and become myself again for a few hours in the workshop, and then walk back in and lose myself again by breakfast. There is a specific loneliness in eating breakfast across from your only son, while pretending you can't quite follow the conversation, and watching him not notice, and watching him be relieved. I remember one morning in particular. Daniel was reading something on his phone, and Priscilla was making eggs. She'd taken over all the cooking by then, which I let her do, because it let me watch what came into the house, and because a man who can't be trusted to cook is a man who can't be trusted to live alone. I asked Daniel, as if I'd forgotten, what it was he did for work again. Just like that. As if I didn't know my own son sold buildings. He looked up, and something crossed his face. Not suspicion. Worse than suspicion. Pity. My boy looked at me with pity, and then he said, gently, like you'd talk to a child, "Real estate, Dad. I develop commercial real estate. Remember?" And I said, "Oh, that's right." And I looked down at my coffee, and under the table, my hand was completely steady, and inside, I was memorizing the exact shape of my son, pitying me, while his wife stole from me, because I knew there would be a day I'd need to remember it clearly. Priscilla watched that whole exchange from the stove. She didn't say anything, but I saw the corner of her mouth move, just slightly, the way a person's mouth moves when a plan is going well. I started leaving small traps, the way you leave telltales at a fire scene, to see if anyone's been moving things. I left a bank statement on the kitchen counter one afternoon, face up, an old one with nothing sensitive on it, and I made a point of forgetting it there and shuffling off to the porch. When I came back 20 minutes later, it had been moved, squared up neatly, and set beneath a magazine, the way you'd tidy something you didn't want a person to realize you'd read. Priscilla had gone through it. She was auditing me the same as I was auditing her. The difference was, she thought she was the only one auditing. I left my reading glasses in odd places and watched who moved them. I mentioned, vaguely, a box of important papers I couldn't quite remember where I'd put, and I watched Priscilla's attention sharpen like a needle, and over the next 3 days, I watched her, when she thought I was napping, go quietly through the closets, and the hall cabinet, and the spare room, looking for a box that did not exist. She never went to the workshop. The workshop, to Priscilla, was where the dust and the machine oil and the old man clutter lived, beneath her notice, and that misjudgment was the single most important thing she got wrong, and I had engineered it on purpose, day by day, by playing the kind of old man whose workshop couldn't possibly hold anything but junk. Every underestimation she made, I fed. I watered it like a garden. But I want to be honest about the nights too, because the days were performance, and the nights were where the truth of what was happening actually landed on me. I would sit in the workshop at 1, 2 in the morning, the space heater ticking, Rosalind's faded notes on the wall, and I would go through the day's recordings and the day's bank movements, and I would build my record, And somewhere in the middle of every night, the investigator would step aside, and just the father would be sitting there. And the father would think, "That is my son. That is Daniel. That is the boy I taught to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot. The boy who cried at his mother's funeral so hard, I had to hold him up. And he is sitting in my dead wife's bedroom, helping his wife take everything I have. And he looked at me this morning with pity. I'd like to tell you I stayed angry. I didn't. Not most nights. Mostly I grieved. I grieved for Daniel, while I built the case that I thought would send him to prison, because I believed, then, that he was a full and willing part of it, and I did not yet know the thing I would only learn later in a fishing cabin 3 hours north, that at the very end, my son was as much a mark as I was. In those weeks, I thought I was catching 2 criminals. I was only right about one of them, and the not knowing, the grieving for a son I thought was fully lost, was the hardest part of the whole performance. There was a night I nearly broke it, nearly walked back into the house and shook Daniel awake and said, I know all of it. How could you? I stood at the workshop door with my hand on the light switch, and I almost did it. And then I heard Rosalind's voice in my head, the thing she used to say when I'd get impatient on a case and want to confront somebody before the evidence was ready. She used to say, Nathaniel, you only get to open the door once. Make sure you're right and make sure you're ready before you open it. So I turned the light off and I went back to work, and I did not open the door. Not yet. Not until I was right and ready, and it would count. I kept collecting. I got better at the performance. And the record in the workshop got thicker and thicker. Screenshot by screenshot. Recording by recording. And Priscilla went on believing she was managing a confused old man toward a facility and an early grave. And every single day, she believed it a little more, because every single day, I made sure she did. By the second week, I understood the shape of what they wanted, even before I had the confession that made it explicit. They wanted 3 things, in order. They wanted me declared unable to manage my own affairs. That was what the documentation of my decline was for. All of Priscilla's worried phone calls and worried comments. All of it building toward a day she could point to a pattern and say, look how far gone he is. Someone has to step in. Second, once I was declared incompetent, they wanted control of my assets, the accounts, and above all the farmhouse and the 11 acres, which they could then sell. And third, they wanted me somewhere else. A facility. Out of the house, out of the way, out of the accounts. And if I happened to decline and die quickly in such a place, so much the better for everyone but me. That was the plan I could see from the inside. What I couldn't see yet, what the confession would reveal, was why the timeline had suddenly become so desperate, why Priscilla had started saying the money's gone, and it's federal in the pantry at night. I knew they wanted my house. I didn't yet know they needed it so badly that when the slow legal path of declaring me incompetent proved too slow, they would reach for something faster and final, in the dark, at 2:47 in the morning. I want to describe one more scene from the fake weakness weeks, because it is the one I think about most, and because it shows you exactly the kind of woman Priscilla was. It was a Sunday. Priscilla had invited a few people over, a couple of Daniel's business acquaintances and their wives, people I didn't know well. And over dinner, in front of these guests, Priscilla staged a little performance of her own, and I understood, watching it, that it was rehearsal, that she was practicing the story she'd eventually tell a judge and a doctor and a court. She asked me, sweetly, in front of everyone, to tell the guests about the time Rosalind and I went to Italy. Now, Rosalind and I never went to Italy. We went to Ireland, once, for our 30th anniversary, and Priscilla knew it, because I'd told the story a dozen times. But she said Italy, and she watched me. And here is the trap. If I corrected her and said Ireland, I'd sound like a stubborn, confused old man, arguing about details. And if I went along and told an Italy story, I'd be confirming, in front of witnesses, that I couldn't tell Italy from Ireland, that my memory of my own life with my own wife had gone soft. She had built a little box, with no good exit, in front of an audience, and she was watching to see which wall I'd walk into. So I did the only thing that beat it. I smiled, and I looked a little sad, and I said, "Oh, you know, at my age the trips all run together. Rosalind was the one who kept track of where we'd been." And I let a little tremor into my voice, and I let my eyes go wet, which wasn't hard, because thinking about Rosalind always made my eyes go wet. And I gave them a beautiful, vague, teary non-answer about how much I missed my wife. And the guests looked at me with sympathy. And Priscilla got exactly the impression she wanted. Poor Nathaniel, so lost without her, so faded. And I gave it to her willingly, because a teary, vague old man who misses his wife is 100 times safer than an old man who says, "That was Ireland, Priscilla, and I remember every hour of it, and I remember every dollar you've moved out of my accounts, too." I walked into no wall. I walked between them, and let her think I'd hit one, and she never knew the difference. That was the night I fully understood that I was not going to beat Priscilla by being smarter than her in the moment. She was too fast, too practiced, too willing. I was going to beat her the way an old lion beats a younger, faster animal, not by being quicker, but by being patient, by being underestimated, by lying still in the grass long past the point where anyone thought I was a threat, and by having, when the moment finally came, one thing she didn't, the truth, written down, recorded, and hidden somewhere she'd never think to look. I also, and this is the part I'm least proud of and most grateful for, started recording. I'm going to be honest with you about the recordings, because I've thought a lot about the ethics of it since. In my state, the law allows a person who is party to a conversation to record it. And in my own home, in the common areas, I had every legal right to know what was being said. So I placed 3 small recorders. One in the kitchen, tucked behind the cookbooks. One in the living room, inside a hollowed-out copy of a hardcover Rosalind had loved. And one, the most important one, in the guest room where they slept. No, I want to be exact, because it matters. I did not record their private bedroom. I placed it in the hallway just outside, on the bookshelf, where it caught what carried through the door. That distinction mattered to me then, and it matters now. For a week and a half, I gathered nothing but ordinary cruelty. Priscilla complaining about me. Daniel defending me weakly, then not at all. The two of them discussing, in flat, practical tones, how much the farmhouse and the 11 acres might be worth. Priscilla saying the word facility more than once, as in, a facility, a place where I might go, a place with people my own age and less to worry about. And then, on a Tuesday night, the Tuesday before the fire, though I didn't know yet what was coming, I got the confession. I was in the workshop the next morning, listening back to the previous night's audio, sipping cold coffee, when I heard Priscilla's voice come through clear from the living room recorder. She thought I was asleep. It was late. Daniel was with her, and she was angry. And when Priscilla was angry, she got careless, and what she said, careless and clear, laid the whole thing bare. She said, "We are running out of time, Daniel. The bishop deadline is in 2 weeks. If we don't close the sale, the money's gone, and if the money's gone, they will find the hole. And if they find the hole, it's not embezzlement anymore. It's federal." I set my coffee down. Daniel said something low I couldn't catch. Priscilla cut him off. She said, "Don't you dare go soft on me now. Your father's 400 was supposed to plug the gap until the Whitman draw funded. There is no Whitman draw. There was never going to be a Whitman draw. We took his money to cover what we already took. And now we need this house sold, and him placed somewhere before the audit, or we both go to prison. Do you understand me? Both of us." And then she said the sentence that I have replayed more times than I can count. She said, "If he finds the second ledger, we're done." The second ledger. I sat in that dusty workshop, 71 years old, and I understood several things at once. The way you understand a fire's whole story, in the instant you finally read the burn correctly. I understood that the 400,000 was never a loan. It was a patch on a much bigger wound. I understood that my son and his wife had already stolen money. Real money. From someone with the power to go federal. Someone named Bishop, or something to do with Bishop. I understood that Meridian Vale wasn't the fraud. It was the tool built to hide the fraud. And I understood that there were two sets of books. A ledger they showed people, and a second ledger, the real one, that told the truth about where everything had actually gone. And they were terrified that I would find it, which meant they believed it was findable, which meant it existed, which meant it was probably, somehow, near me. I did not confront them. Every instinct I'd built over 4 decades screamed at me not to let them see the room change. A cornered animal that knows it's cornered does desperate things. So the next morning, I poured the coffee, and I asked Priscilla the same question twice, and I let her sigh. And inside, I had gone very still and very cold, the way I used to go on the worst scenes, the fatal ones, when getting it right actually mattered. I called Elena Cruz from the truck that afternoon, and I told her everything. The LLC, Priscilla as registered agent, the recording, the Bishop deadline, the second ledger. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Mr. Reyes, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This just became something much larger than a family dispute. If what you heard is accurate, your son and daughter-in-law have committed serious financial crimes against a third party, and they are under a hard time pressure to liquidate your assets. People under that kind of pressure become dangerous. I want you to promise me you will not confront them, and I want to bring in someone I trust." The someone she trusted was named Frank Delgado, a retired financial crimes investigator turned licensed private investigator, a man who had spent 20 years unwinding exactly the kind of shell company fraud I was staring at. Elena set up a meeting for 2 days later, in her office, 2 counties away. I told Daniel and Priscilla I had a doctor's appointment and needed the whole day. Priscilla, I noticed, looked pleased that I was seeing a doctor. It fit her story. I never made it to that meeting on the day we planned, because the night before, the house caught fire. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because I lived it, and because reading fire is the one thing in this world I have never once gotten wrong. I woke at 2:47 in the morning. I know the time because the power had already failed and my bedside clock was dead, but my watch, Rosalind gave it to me for our 40th, glowed 2:47 when I pressed the light. I woke because of the smell. Not smoke, not yet. Before the smoke there's another smell, sharp and chemical and wrong, and my body knew it before my mind did. 40 years of training will wake you out of a dead sleep when your nose finds that smell. Accelerant. I was out of bed and moving before I was fully awake. My bedroom was on the ground floor, thank God. At the back, I could see orange light pulsing under the door. I put my hand flat against the wood, cool at the bottom, warm at the top, which told me the fire was above and moving down the stairwell, which told me it had started upstairs, or in the front, which told me my exit through the back was still good if I moved now. I want to be clear about something. Daniel and Priscilla's room was upstairs, and in that moment, in the dark, with my house burning around me, I did not think about the ledger, or the fraud, or the $400,000. I thought about my son. I went toward the stairs. The stairwell was a column of fire. I got 3 steps up, and the heat drove me back. And through the roar, I shouted his name. Daniel, Daniel. And I want to tell you I heard him call back, and I ran to save him. But that isn't what happened. What happened is that I stood at the bottom of my burning staircase, screaming my son's name into a wall of flame, and no one answered. And then I heard, over the roar, the unmistakable sound of my own truck engine turning over in the driveway. I made it out the back door, with my lungs full of poison, and my eyebrows singed, and the watch Rosalind gave me still on my wrist. I staggered around the side of the house into the cold spring night, and I was in time to see the taillights of my own pickup truck disappearing down the gravel drive. 2 figures inside. I saw them against the porch light, before the porch light was swallowed. Daniel driving, Priscilla beside him. They were not upstairs. They had never been upstairs. They had gotten out, or had never gone to bed, and they had taken my truck and left me in the fire. I stood in my own yard and watched 40 years of my life, with Rosalind, burned to the foundation. The workshop, thank God, was a separate building 40 yards back, and the fire didn't reach it that night. But the house, the porch where Rosalind read, the kitchen where we ate 10,000 breakfasts, the bedroom where she died holding my hand, all of it went. The volunteer fire company got there in 19 minutes. Too late for the house. Just in time for me, maybe. A young paramedic put an oxygen mask on my face and asked me if anyone else had been inside, and I said, My son was upstairs, and even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true, and I didn't understand yet why they'd left me to die, but taken the truck, and the not understanding was almost worse than the burns. By dawn, the fire was out, and the truth of the fire was written all over what was left, in a language only I could read. While the investigators from the county did their walkthrough that morning, I did mine. They didn't want me to. I was a victim, they said, and I should rest. But the fire marshal on scene was a man named Osei, who I'd trained 15 years before, and when he recognized me under the soot and the shock, he did something kind. He let me walk the scene with him, quietly, off the record, one old cause and origin man to another. And what we read there told a story the county's paperwork would take weeks to catch up to. The fire had 2 points of origin, 2, one in the upstairs hallway, outside the guest room, and one in the downstairs front room. A fire doesn't start in 2 separate places by accident. 2 points of origin is the signature of a set fire. Every time, no exception. Osei saw it the same instant I did. He crouched by the char pattern near the stairs and looked up at me, and neither of us had to say the word. Arson. There was more. The burn was fast and hot, in a way ordinary house contents don't produce. The pour pattern, the way the accelerant had run and soaked before it lit, was visible in the scorching on what remained of the subfloor, and near the base of the stairs, in the spot that would cut off the ground floor bedroom's occupant from the front exit, someone had concentrated the accelerant, as if to make sure that whoever was sleeping downstairs would wake to find the fire between them and the door. Between me and the door. I understood then, kneeling in the wet ash beside a man I'd taught to read exactly this, that the fire had not been meant to cover the fraud by destroying documents. Or not only that, the fire had been meant to destroy me. They needed the house sold and me placed before the audit. But selling and placing takes time, and the Bishop deadline was 2 weeks out, and they were out of time. A dead father is faster than a placed one. A dead father leaves a will. And I had let them believe, for months, that they had no idea what was in it or where it was. They tried to burn me down to the foundation, the same as the house. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the old lion they'd been stepping over for months, the confused old man who couldn't find his own glasses, had spent his whole life learning to survive exactly this, and had already built, Out in the workshop they never entered. Everything he needed to end them. Detective Ramos took my statement that afternoon. And this is where the story of the missing son truly begins. Because Ramos did not believe me. I told him the fire was set. He said the county would determine cause and origin, and that these old farmhouses go up fast, and that I'd had a terrible shock. I told him my son and his wife had taken my truck and left me inside. He said gently that in a panic people flee, that Daniel might have thought I'd already gotten out, that trauma distorts memory. I told him about the LLC and the 400,000 and the recording of Priscilla saying, if he finds the second ledger, we're done. And Ramos, I'll be fair to him. He wasn't a bad man, just a tired one with too many cases. Ramos said that a recording made in my house of my family's private conversation might not be admissible, that a business dispute wasn't his department, and that if I wanted to pursue financial claims against my son, I should talk to a lawyer. And then he told me Daniel was gone. The truck had been found abandoned. 12 hours later, in a park-and-ride lot, 40 miles away. No sign of Daniel or Priscilla. Their phones were off. Their own house, the one supposedly being renovated, was empty, cleared out. The renovation a lie, like everything else. Daniel had, in the eyes of the law, simply left. An adult who chose to disappear. No body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play. And a grown man, Ramos reminded me, who had every financial reason to run. That's when he said the thing I opened this story with. He looked at me in that parking lot and he said, adults leave, and there was no evidence of anything but a burned house and a son who ran. I want you to understand the shape of what I was standing in. My wife was 3 years dead. My house was ash. My son was gone. Either a criminal who'd tried to murder me and fled, or some small broken part of me still whispered, a victim himself, dragged into something by Priscilla and now in danger. My $400,000 had vanished into a shell company. The one detective on the case had, kindly and completely, decided I was a confused old man who'd lost the thread. Most men my age, in that parking lot, would have gone home to whatever home was left, and grieved and let it go. Let the insurance sort the house. Let the lawyers sort the money. Let the boy be gone. I drove to the workshop, because everything I needed was still there. The fire had spared it. My files, my recorders. I'd retrieved the kitchen and living room ones. Weeks of habit had taught me to check nightly, and they were in the workshop safe, undamaged. My laptop, my notebook, my screenshots of every transfer Priscilla had made, my photographs of the promissory note, the state registry printout showing Priscilla as registered agent of Meridian Vale. And one more thing, the thing they were most afraid of, though I didn't know I had it yet. I had the second ledger. I just didn't know where. Let me tell you how I found it, because it is the hinge on which everything turned, and because Rosalind is the reason. For 3 days after the fire, I stayed in a small motel outside town, and I worked out of the workshop by day. I called Elena and Frank Delgado, and now, with a burned house and a fled son, and hard evidence of a shell company, they took it seriously, in a way that would have been impossible a week earlier. Frank started pulling threads on Meridian Vale, and on the name Bishop. Elena started documenting everything, for what she said would become both a criminal referral and a civil action. But the ledger, Priscilla had said, if he finds the second ledger, we're done. And that meant it was findable. And I could not stop thinking that findable meant it was somewhere Daniel had reason to believe I might stumble on it, which meant it was somewhere connected to me, to the house, to the property. On the 4th day, sitting in the workshop, I looked up at the wall where Rosalind's old notes were still taped. The workshop had been the one place untouched, so her handwriting was still there, faded reminders and jokes from years ago. And I thought about my wife, Rosalind, the chemistry teacher, Rosalind with the steel trap mind. And I remembered something. When Daniel was a boy, and later, when he was a young man who kept getting into scrapes, Rosalind had a rule. She used to say, "If you're going to hide something important, don't hide it where it's yours. Hide it where it's mine, because no one looks through a mother's things." She used to hide Daniel's birthday presents in her own sewing chest. Later, when Daniel was in his 20s and going through a rough divorce from a first marriage nobody talks about, he'd stored some sensitive papers, a passport, some cash, in Rosalind's cedar chest, the one thing of hers I'd kept, the one thing I'd moved from the old house to the farmhouse and, because it was hers and I couldn't bear to open it, had carried out to the workshop and set in the corner under a tarp 3 years ago, and never touched. I hadn't opened Rosalind's cedar chest since she died. It was too much. It still smelled like her. I opened it that afternoon, with hands that shook. Her sweaters were on top, folded the way she folded them, her scarves, a packet of my letters to her, from when we were young, tied with a ribbon, that I had to set aside and not look at, or I'd have come apart entirely. And underneath, at the bottom, wrapped in one of her scarves, was a slim, external hard drive and a spiral notebook that was not Rosalind's. It was Daniel's handwriting. He had hidden it in his dead mother's cedar chest, in his father's workshop, exactly the way she'd taught him, because he believed I would never open it. He was almost right. If Priscilla had known where he'd put it, she'd have burned the workshop too. But Daniel hadn't told her. I would understand why. Later. In that moment, I only knew that my hands were holding the second ledger, and my son had used his mother's own hiding place, the lesson she'd given him in love, to conceal the evidence of a fraud that had nearly killed me. I sat on the workshop floor, and I did not cry for the money or the house. I cried for the boy who used to hide his presents in his mother's sewing chest. And then I stopped crying, and I opened the notebook, and I read the burn. The second ledger was everything Elena and Frank needed, and more than I could have imagined. It was Daniel's own record, kept, I think, because some part of him needed to know the truth, even as he lived the lie. And what it showed was this: Daniel and Priscilla's development company hadn't just failed. For 3 years, it had been running on money that wasn't theirs. There was a real anchor investor behind the whole operation, the Bishop of Priscilla's panicked deadline. Not a person named Bishop, it turned out, but the Bishop Family Trust, a large private investment fund that had put $9 million into Daniel's projects over 4 years, believing the money was going into real, permitted, tenanted developments. It wasn't. The ledger laid out, in Daniel's own cramped writing and in the spreadsheets on that hard drive, how the money had actually moved. New investor funds, used to pay returns to earlier investors, draws taken against projects that didn't exist, fabricated tenant agreements. Priscilla's shell companies, Meridian Vale was one of 5, used to route money out and disguise the holes. It was, in plain terms, a Ponzi scheme wearing the suit of a real estate firm, and it was collapsing. The Bishop Trust had scheduled a comprehensive audit, the audit Priscilla kept calling the deadline, and when that audit hit, it would find a $9 million hole where $9 million of developments were supposed to be. My $400,000 had gone in as a desperate patch, weeks before the audit, to keep the newest returns paid, so nothing would look wrong until they could sell my house and clear out. And there, in the last entries of the ledger, dated the week before the fire, I found something that changed how I understood everything. Daniel had started keeping a separate list, a list of dates and dollar amounts labeled, in his handwriting, P. Solo. Priscilla, alone. Transfers I could now see, cross-referenced against the bank records I'd already gathered, that moved money out of the shared shell companies and into accounts that Frank Delgado would later confirm were Priscilla's alone, offshore, hidden even from Daniel. She had been stealing from the scheme, skimming from the fraud, building herself an escape hatch with money Daniel didn't know was gone. The final entry, 3 days before the house burned, was a note Daniel had written to himself, and it read, "P knows about the audit before me. P moving faster than she's telling me. Am I the fall guy? My son, God help him, had been a criminal, but he had also, at the very end, been a mark. Priscilla had used him to build the fraud and was preparing to leave him holding it. And the fire, I understood now, the fire wasn't just to kill me. It was to erase the workshop's location from Daniel's mind as an option, to force a fast sale, and, I came to believe, to remove Daniel too. Because a fall guy who runs is convenient, but a fall guy who's dead in a house fire with his father can't ever cut a deal and name his wife. I had to find out whether my son was a fugitive or a victim, and the ledger, and the hard drive, and one more recording I hadn't yet listened to, were going to tell me. Here is where I have to tell you about the second betrayal, the one underneath the one I already knew, because it is the thing that turned this from a fraud case into a fight for my son's life. Frank Delgado came out to the workshop on the 5th day. He was a compact, quiet man, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the patient manner of someone who has spent decades watching money lie. I gave him the ledger and the hard drive and my files, and I watched him go through them, and I watched his eyebrows climb. He confirmed what I'd found about the Ponzi structure within an hour. But before he found the thing that changed everything, I watched him work, and I want to tell you about it, because watching Frank Delgado read money the way I read fire was one of the strangest and most instructive experiences of my life, and because it's how the second betrayal came to light, one thread at a time. Frank worked the way I imagine I looked to younger investigators when I was in my prime. Slow, quiet, methodical, seeming almost to do nothing for long stretches, and then suddenly seeing the whole structure at once. He spread Daniel's ledger and the printouts from the hard drive across my workbench, and he laid a legal pad beside them, and for the first hour he barely spoke. He just read, and made small marks, and occasionally grunted. Then he started asking questions, and the questions were an education. He asked me the exact date Daniel had asked, for the 400,000. I told him. He asked the exact date Meridian Vale had been formed. I showed him the registry printout, 3 weeks before. He nodded slowly and made a mark. He asked whether, in the months before Daniel asked me for money, I'd noticed him selling anything, downsizing anything, cutting back. I thought about it and said no. If anything, the cars and the suits had gotten nicer. Frank nodded again, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "That's the tell. A legitimate business in trouble contracts. It sells the boat, lets people go, tightens up. A fraud in trouble expands. It has to, because the whole thing only survives as long as it looks successful. The nicer the suits got, the closer to collapse he was. Success is the costume a fraud wears to the funeral of the truth." I sat with that. My son's expensive life, the thing that had reassured me, had actually been the alarm bell, if only I'd known how to hear it. Frank walked me through the mechanics of what Daniel and Priscilla had built, and I'm going to explain it the way he explained it to me, plainly, because I think you should understand exactly what was done, not just that something bad happened. A real estate development, done honestly, works like this, Frank said. You find a piece of land and a tenant who wants a building on it. You get investors to put up money. You use that money to actually build the thing. The building generates rent, the rent pays the investors back with profit. Everyone is happy, and, this is the key, At every stage, there is a real building you can go stand in front of and touch. The money is tied to something that exists in the physical world. What Daniel and Priscilla had done was sever that tie. Early on, Frank believed, there had probably been one or two real projects, or half-real ones, enough to establish credibility, enough to show the Bishop Trust and other investors a genuine building or two, and say, look, we deliver. But somewhere along the line, a project had failed, or the money had been spent, or both, and instead of admitting the loss, they had covered it, with money from the next investor. And once you do that, Frank said, you're dead. You just don't know it yet, because now you need a new investor every time to pay the last one. And each new investor is a bigger hole than the one before, and the whole thing becomes a machine that runs on nothing but fresh money and the appearance of success, until the day the fresh money stops. That is a Ponzi scheme, Frank said, whatever fancier name they gave it. And the ledger proved that's exactly what it had become. Fabricated tenant agreements, leases for stores that were never going to exist, in buildings that were never going to be built, used to convince investors the projects were real. Fake draw schedules, paperwork showing money being drawn against construction that wasn't happening, and the shell companies, 5 of them, Meridian Vale among them, that existed for one purpose, to move money in circles fast enough that no single investor could see it, was the same money going around and around, or see that a large portion of it wasn't going into any building at all, but out the side, into Daniel and Priscilla's life, and, Frank was about to discover, into Priscilla's life alone. The Bishop Family Trust was the biggest and last investor, $9 million over 4 years. And the trust had done something the smaller investors hadn't. It had scheduled a full forensic audit, not because it suspected fraud, at first, just good governance, a routine deep review of where its money had gone. But a full forensic audit is the one thing a Ponzi cannot survive, because it doesn't ask to see the paperwork, it asks to see the buildings, and it follows every dollar to where it actually landed. When Priscilla said the deadline over and over in that pantry, when she said if the money's gone they'll find the hole, that audit was the deadline. It was the day the fresh money would run out of places to hide, and the buildings that didn't exist would be revealed to not exist. My 400,000, Frank confirmed, had gone in as exactly what Priscilla had called it, in her own careless words, a patch. In the weeks before the audit, they needed the newest investor returns paid on time, because a missed payment would trigger scrutiny early, before they were ready to run. So they took my money and used it to pay other people, to keep the appearance alive a few weeks longer, long enough to sell my house and vanish. My savings, Rosalind's life insurance, 40 years of our work, had been spent making sure a fraud looked healthy for one more month. I asked Frank, at that point, the question that had been sitting in me since I first read the ledger. I asked him, if the whole thing was collapsing anyway, if the audit was going to expose everything in 2 weeks no matter what, why the fire? Why try to kill me? What did burning me down actually get them, if the fraud was doomed regardless? Frank set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, that's the right question, and I don't think you're going to like the answer, and I don't think you've found all of it yet. Let me keep pulling. And that's when he found the thing I'd missed, because he knew how to look for it and I didn't. The P solo accounts. Frank traced them further than I could, and he found that in the 2 weeks before the fire, Priscilla had done 2 things. She had moved just over $2.1 million into an offshore account under a name that wasn't hers or Daniel's, and she had, 11 days before the fire, taken out a life insurance policy on Daniel for $2 million, with herself as sole beneficiary. Let me tell you exactly how Frank found it, because the finding was a small, quiet thing, and the meaning of it was enormous. And the gap between the two is the whole reason I needed a man like Frank Delgado. He was cross-referencing the shell company transfers in Daniel's ledger against the actual bank records I'd photographed. And he kept coming back to one thing. In Daniel's own accounting, the money that flowed through the 5 shell companies mostly flowed in circles. In from an investor, out to pay an earlier investor, around and around, the machine keeping itself alive. Daniel had tracked all of it. His ledger, for all that it documented a crime, was meticulous. My son was many things, but sloppy with numbers was not one of them. Rosalind had taught him that much. But Frank found a set of outflows that Daniel's ledger noted only glancingly, in that separate short list I'd already seen, labeled P solo. Money leaving the shell companies and not coming back, not paying any investor, not circling, just leaving. And Daniel's notation next to those entries wasn't his usual clean accounting. It was uncertain, questioning, the handwriting of a man noticing something he didn't fully understand and didn't want to believe. Small question marks. A note that just said, "Where?" Frank followed the where. It took him the better part of that afternoon, and he had to use tools and databases I don't have access to and wouldn't know how to read. But he followed the money out of the shell companies and through 2 intermediary accounts and into, finally, an account held under a name that was not Daniel Reyes and was not Priscilla Reyes, but which Frank, through means he explained and I won't repeat here, was able to connect to Priscilla and to Priscilla alone. An offshore account. And the total that had moved into it, over the 18 months before the fire, was $2,140,000. $2.1 million, skimmed out of the fraud, into an account Daniel didn't fully know about and couldn't touch, held under a name that wasn't either of theirs. Frank sat back and took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, slowly, the way a man does when he needs a second before he says something serious. And then he explained to me what it meant, and it was the moment the whole story turned over and showed me its true face. He said, "Your son thought he and his wife were partners in this. Criminals, but partners, sinking or swimming together. That's what the ledger shows. Daniel tracking the shared money, trying to keep the shared machine alive, trying to survive the audit together. But Priscilla wasn't his partner, not really, not for a long time. While Daniel was bailing water to keep their shared boat afloat, Priscilla was quietly drilling holes in his side of it and filling her own private lifeboat. $2.1 million of it. She was never planning to survive the audit with him. She was planning to survive it without him. And then Frank found the second document, and this was the one that made the fire make sense. Among the records I'd gathered was a stack of Priscilla's correspondence I hadn't been able to interpret. Insurance-looking paperwork I'd photographed off her desk one afternoon during the fake weakness weeks, not understanding what it was. Only understanding that anything on Priscilla's desk was worth photographing. I'd handed it to Frank with everything else. He went through it now with new eyes, knowing what he was looking for. And he found it. A life insurance policy, taken out 11 days before the fire, on the life of Daniel Reyes, in the amount of $2 million, with the sole beneficiary listed as Priscilla Reyes. 11 days before the fire. Frank set the paper down and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Mr. Reyes, I've seen a lot of ugly things. Your daughter-in-law built a hidden fortune, insured your son's life for $2 million, and then a fire started that was designed to kill the 2 men who could testify against her. I don't think your son ran. I think your son was supposed to die in that fire with you. And I think the only reason he's not dead is that he figured it out at the last second and ran instead. And if he ran, then right now he is a man who knows too much, alone, with a wife who needs him gone, and 2 million reasons to find him first." The pieces came together in front of me then, all at once, the way the origin of a fire suddenly becomes obvious once you finally see the one char pattern that explains all the others. Here was Priscilla's real plan, the one underneath the one I'd uncovered. The slow plan, declaring me incompetent, taking my assets, selling the house, placing me in a facility. That had been the plan while there was time. But the audit had moved up, or they'd fallen further behind than expected, and time had run out. 2 weeks was not enough to legally strip a competent man of his home and sell it. So Priscilla had reached for something faster. If the farmhouse burned with me in it, she didn't need to declare me incompetent or fight me for the property. As Daniel's father, my estate would pass, and Daniel, or Daniel's estate, would inherit, and the property and insurance on the house would flow into the family, into reach. And if Daniel died in the same fire, then Priscilla, as his widow, would inherit everything he had, plus collect $2 million in life insurance on him, plus keep the $2.1 million she'd already hidden offshore, plus, and this was the coldest part, the 2 men who could ever testify that the fraud was hers, that the shell companies traced to her, that the missing money was in her account, would both be ash. No witnesses, a grieving widow, a tragic accident, a house fire in an old farmhouse, so common, so easily explained, exactly as Detective Ramos had tried to explain it to me in that parking lot. She wasn't trying to cover the fraud by burning documents. She was trying to erase the only 2 people who could name her, collect on their deaths, and walk away rich and free, while the fraud collapsed onto 2 dead men who couldn't defend themselves. And it had failed for one reason, and one reason only. A smell. A sharp chemical wrongness in the air at 2:47 in the morning, and 40 years of training that fired in my sleep and got me up and out of a burning house before the fire she'd built to kill me could close the door. If I'd slept 10 minutes longer, if I'd been anyone but a man who'd spent his life learning that exact smell, there would have been 2 bodies in that farmhouse, and Priscilla would have gotten everything, and no one would ever have known. Instead, there was one stubborn old man in a motel outside town, with a workshop full of evidence, and somewhere to the north, alive, a son who'd figured it out 1 second before it was too late. I have investigated hundreds of fires. I have delivered terrible news to hundreds of families. I have never, in my life, felt the specific cold that went through me when Frank Delgado told me my son was not a villain who'd abandoned me, but a target being hunted by his own wife, and that the clock that had been ticking toward an audit was now ticking toward whichever of us found Daniel first. The old me, the father, wanted to fall apart. The other me, the investigator, the one Rosalind used to call her cause and origin man, went very still and started to work. Because now I understood the whole fire. 2 points of origin. One upstairs, outside the room where Daniel and Priscilla slept, except Priscilla wouldn't have set a fire that could trap herself, which meant either she set it knowing exactly how she'd exit, or the upstairs origin was meant to make it look like the fire started up there and caught them by surprise, giving her a clean story. We barely escaped, but poor Nathaniel and poor Daniel didn't make it. And one downstairs, positioned to cut me off. It was a fire, built to produce 2 bodies and one grieving widow, with $2 million in insurance, $2.1 million offshore, and a $9 million fraud, conveniently buried with the only 2 men who could name her. It had failed for one reason: me. The accelerant smell that woke me at 2:47. 40 years of training, firing in my sleep, had cost Priscilla her clean double murder, and turned it into a single fled fall guy, and a single stubborn old man she thought didn't matter. She had underestimated the old lion. They always do. That's the whole point of an old lion. He lies still in the grass, gray and slow and easy to step over, right up until the moment he isn't. But being underestimated only wins if you use it. And I had one advantage that Priscilla, for all her planning, could not have accounted for. I knew where Daniel would go, because I knew my son, and I knew his mother's rule. If you have to hide, don't hide where it's yours, hide where it's mine. There was a fishing cabin, not mine, Rosalind's father's, an old shack on a lake 3 hours north that had passed to Rosalind and then, in a tangle of estate paperwork, technically to a small family trust in Rosalind's maiden name that Daniel and I were both beneficiaries of. It was, on paper, nowhere connected to me or to Daniel by our own names. It was hidden where it was hers, and Daniel and I had gone there every summer of his childhood. It was the one place on earth he might run to, that Priscilla, who'd never once been there, who found the outdoors distasteful, who wouldn't know the trust existed, could not find. I didn't call the police. I want to be honest about that choice. Ramos thought I was a confused old man. If I called and said my daughter-in-law is trying to murder my fugitive son at a cabin owned by a trust in my dead wife's maiden name, based on a hard drive I found in a cedar chest and a recording that might not be admissible, I'd have gotten a welfare check and a psychiatric referral and lost the only lead I had. Frank agreed. He said the case wasn't ready to survive contact with a skeptical detective. Not yet. He said, "Give me 48 hours to package this so airtight that no one can wave it away. And in the meantime, if your son is at that cabin, someone has to reach him before she does." I said, "I'll go." Frank said, "You're 71 years old." I said, "That's exactly why she won't be watching for me." I drove 3 hours north the next morning in a rental car, because my truck was in a county evidence lot, with the hard drive and the ledger, and copies of everything locked in a bag, having left the originals with Elena and a full written account of where I was going, and why, with both her and Frank, because the one thing you learn from a career in fire is that you always leave a record that outlives you. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track, gray and weathered, exactly as I remembered it. And parked behind it, hidden from the road under a stand of pines, was a car I didn't recognize, with a rental sticker in the window. I want to tell you about that drive north, because 3 hours alone on a highway gives a man time to think, and I did more thinking on that drive than I'd done in years. I thought about all the times Daniel and I had made that same drive when he was a boy, the two of us, and sometimes Rosalind, up to her father's cabin for a week of fishing every August. I could remember Daniel at 8 in the back seat, asking every 20 minutes if we were there yet. Daniel at 14, sullen and quiet, pretending he was too old for it. And then the moment we'd arrive, and he'd be a kid again, the second his line hit the water. Daniel at 20, bringing a girl for the first time. All of it on this road. And now, I was driving it at 71 in a rental car, with a bag full of evidence, not knowing if my son at the other end would be alive, or a fugitive, or a body, or the boy I remembered, or a stranger. I thought about the fact that I was doing something reckless. I want to be honest with you about that. A sensible 71-year-old man does not drive 3 hours alone to a remote cabin where his fugitive son may be hiding, and where a woman who has already tried to murder him twice, once by fire, and, if she found this place, would surely try again, might already be. Frank had said it plainly. "You're 71 years old." He was right. If Priscilla had somehow beaten me there, I was driving toward the most dangerous person I'd ever encountered, alone, with no weapon but the truth, and no backup but a written account in a lawyer's office. But here is what I understood on that drive, and it's the thing I most want the older people listening to this to hear. There is a moment in a long life when you stop asking whether a thing is sensible and start asking whether it's yours to do. Saving my son was mine to do. Not the detective's. He thought Daniel had simply run. Not Frank's. He was building the case. Mine. I was Daniel's father, the only one he had left, and his mother was 3 years in the ground. And if there was one chance to reach him before Priscilla did, then a sensible old man in a facility somewhere was no use to anybody. And the only version of me worth being was the one who got in the car. So I drove, and I watched the country change from town to farmland to forest, and I watched the light go long and gold through the pines, the way it used to on those August drives, and somewhere in the last hour, I stopped being afraid and just became certain, the way I used to become certain, on a scene, when all the evidence finally pointed one direction. My son was up there, and I was going to reach him. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track, gray and weathered, exactly as I remembered it, and parked behind it, hidden from the road under a stand of pines, was a car I didn't recognize, with a rental sticker in the window. My heart stopped for a moment when I saw that car, because my first thought was Priscilla. But then I looked closer, and I saw the rental sticker, and I understood. Priscilla wouldn't be in a rental, and more than that, Priscilla didn't know this place existed. The car was Daniel's. A man on the run doesn't drive his own car. He rents one with what cash he has, and he disappears. I parked, and I sat for a moment, with my hands on the wheel, and then I got out into the pine-smelling cold, and I walked up to the door of Rosalind's father's cabin, and I knocked, and I said, through the door, in a voice I worked to keep steady, "Daniel, it's your father, it's Dad. I'm alone. Open the door." There was a long silence, a silence so long I began to be afraid of what it meant, and then I heard movement inside, slow and careful, and the sound of something heavy being moved away from the door. He'd barricaded it. My son had barricaded himself inside his dead grandfather's cabin, and then the door opened. I found my son inside, and he was alive, and when he saw me in the doorway, he made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a child, and the story of what actually happened the night of the fire came out of him in pieces over the next 2 hours, and it was worse and stranger than even Frank had guessed. He looked terrible. 4 days of hiding had hollowed him out, unshaven, thin, his eyes red-rimmed and darting, a man who hadn't really slept since the fire. When he saw it was truly me, truly alone, truly real, his legs seemed to go out from under him, and he sat down hard on the old wooden bench by the door, and he put his face in his hands, and he said, over and over, "You're alive, you're alive, oh God, you're alive, I thought you," and he couldn't finish it. And I understood, watching him come apart, that whatever else was true about my son, whatever crimes he'd committed, he had spent 4 days in this cabin believing he had left his own father to die in a fire. That he'd gotten in that truck and driven away while I burned. That belief had been eating him alive up here, alone, in the dark, and seeing me in the doorway had just lifted it off him, and the weight of its lifting had knocked him down. I sat down on the bench next to my son, and I put my arm around him the way I had at his mother's funeral, and I let him fall apart, and I did not say anything for a long time. I'd come here not knowing if I'd find a criminal or a victim. What I'd found was my child, and that turned out to be the truest thing, underneath everything else. When he'd calmed enough to talk, I made us both coffee on the cabin's old propane stove, and we sat at the table where his grandfather used to clean fish, and my son told me everything, and I listened the way I've listened to 100 people describe the worst night of their lives. Daniel had known about the audit. He'd known the whole thing was collapsing. He told me about that first, how the business had started, more or less honestly, and how the first real project had gone bad, a tenant pulling out after the money was committed, and how instead of taking the loss, he'd covered it with the next investor's money, telling himself it was temporary, telling himself he'd make it right when the next project funded, and how the next project had the same problem, and the one after, and how, somewhere in there, without ever quite deciding to, he'd become a man running a fraud, always one investor away from catastrophe, always telling himself he'd fix it, and how Priscilla had not only known, but had become the architect of the machinery that kept it hidden, the shell companies, the fabricated leases, all of it. She was better at it than he was, he said, colder, more patient. He'd tell himself they were in survival mode, just trying to get to the next project that would make it all real again. She, he was coming to understand, had been running a different game entirely. He told me about my 400,000, and he wept again then, because he said the worst thing he ever did was sit at Rosalind's kitchen table and ask his own father for money he knew was going to pay other people. And he'd known even as he asked, and he'd done it anyway, because Priscilla had convinced him it was the only way to buy time, and because he was drowning, and a drowning man grabs whatever's closest, even if it's his own father. But he had not known, until the night of the fire, that Priscilla had taken out a policy on his life. He told me how he found it. It was that evening, the evening before the fire. Priscilla had been on edge for days, snapping at him, disappearing for long phone calls, and he'd started, finally, to feel that something was wrong beyond the audit. That night, she'd left a bag on the bed while she showered, and a folder had slid partway out, and Daniel, who had spent months not looking too closely at anything Priscilla did, because looking too closely meant seeing things he didn't want to see. For some reason that night, he looked, and he saw an insurance document, and he saw his own name on it as the insured, and he saw $2 million, and he saw Priscilla's name as the beneficiary, and he saw the date, 11 days earlier. He said the floor seemed to drop out of the world. He stood there holding it, and all the small wrong things of the past weeks suddenly arranged themselves into one clear, terrible shape, the way scattered evidence suddenly arranges itself into an origin. The long phone calls, the way she'd stopped fighting with him about the audit, as if she'd stopped worrying about it, as if she'd found another way out. The way she'd been so insistent they come stay at the farmhouse, so patient with my supposed decline, so focused on the property. He understood, standing there, that his wife had a plan that did not include him being alive, and that whatever it was close. He put the folder back. He didn't confront her. He told me he was too frightened, that some animal part of him knew that if he let her see that he'd seen, it would happen faster, so he said nothing. He lay awake beside her in the dark, his heart pounding, trying to decide what to do, telling himself he'd figure it out in the morning. He'd get me out of the house. He'd go to someone. He'd find a way. And then, at 2:47 in the morning, the smoke alarm went off. Daniel woke to a room already hazing with smoke, and he woke to find that Priscilla was not in the bed beside him. She was standing near the door, dressed, fully dressed, at 2:47 in the morning, in a house filling with smoke, calm, her shoes on, a bag over her shoulder. And she looked at him across that smoky room, and he told me that in her face there was no fear at all, only a kind of cold assessment. And in that instant, he understood everything, completely, the way you understand a thing you cannot possibly be wrong about. He understood that the fire was not an accident. He understood that he was in the house that was meant to be his grave. He understood that his wife had dressed and packed and was standing by the only door while he was meant to sleep and burn. He said, he asked her, his voice a whisper across the cabin table, remembering it. He asked her, "What did you do?" And Priscilla said, calm as anything, "We have to go, Daniel. The house is on fire." And she said it in a voice for an audience that wasn't there, a rehearsal of the story she'd tell later. The terrified wife. We barely got out. And he understood that the audience she was rehearsing for was the one that would exist after he and I were dead. And something in him, some pure survival instinct, told him, do not let her see that you know. Get out of this room. Get out of this house. He asked her where I was, where his father was. And this is the thing that saved my life and damned her. The lie she told to keep my son from coming to find me. She said, "Your father already got out. I saw him go out the back. He's outside. We have to go." She said I was already safe. She told my son I was out of the house so that he wouldn't run toward my room, so that he wouldn't try to save me, so that I would burn alone in the back bedroom while she got Daniel out the front, because she needed Daniel out of the house and into a place where she could deal with him, and she needed me to stay in and die. And Daniel, in the smoke and the terror and the roar, believed her, or half believed her. He told me he wasn't sure, that some part of him screamed to go check, to find me, but the smoke was thick and the fire was loud, and Priscilla was pulling him toward the door, saying, "He's outside, we have to go now." And the staircase behind him was already a wall of flame, and he ran. He ran out the front and toward the vehicles, and the closest was my truck, and the keys were in it, the way they always were out at the farmhouse. And he got in, and Priscilla got in beside him, still playing her part. Oh my God, the house. And they drove. He told me that as they went down the gravel drive he looked back, and he saw the whole house engulfed, and he did not see me. And Priscilla kept saying he got out, he's fine. And Daniel wanted so badly for it to be true that he let himself believe it, for a few miles, until the shock started to wear off, and the terrible arithmetic started to work in him. The insurance policy, the packed bag, the calm face, the lie. And he began to understand that if Priscilla had been willing to burn him, she had certainly been willing to burn me, and that he got out the back was probably the last lie in a marriage built on them. By the time they reached the park and ride, 40 miles on, Daniel was no longer in shock. He was in terror of a specific and clear-eyed kind. He understood that he was sitting next to a woman who had tried to murder him and his father that very night, and who had 2 million reasons to make sure he didn't survive to tell anyone. And when Priscilla told him, at that park and ride, that they needed to split up, that it was safer to disappear separately, that she'd take one car and he'd take another, and they'd reconnect when it was safe, Daniel understood that she was giving him a chance to walk away from her, and he took it, not because he believed her plan, but because the most dangerous place in the world was beside her, and any distance was better than none. He didn't reconnect with her. He rented a car with the cash he had, and he drove north, to the one place on earth he felt safe, the one place he was certain she could never find, because it was his grandfather's, in his dead grandfather's name, hidden where it was his mother's family's, and not his, following, without even thinking about it, the rule his mother had taught him as a boy: if you have to hide, hide where it's mine. He'd been at the cabin 4 days when I knocked on the door. 4 days of believing he'd left me to burn. 4 days of understanding that his wife had tried to kill him. 4 days of not daring to call anyone because he didn't know who was safe, and he was, in the eyes of the law, a man who'd fled a fire, a fraudster, a fugitive. 4 days alone with the worst things he'd ever done, and the worst thing that had ever been done to him. And then his father, who he thought was dead, knocked on the door and said, "It's Dad. I'm alone. Open the door." He ran, not to save the fraud, not to abandon me. He swore to me, weeping, that in the chaos and smoke he believed I'd already gotten out the back, that he'd heard the back door, that Priscilla had told him I was already out. She lied to him to keep him from coming to find me. He got to the truck because it was closest, and Priscilla got in with him because her plan had failed the instant he woke and ran. She couldn't very well stay behind and let him escape to tell the story. So she fled with him, playing the terrified wife, and 40 miles away at that park and ride, She'd told him they had to split up, had to disappear separately. It was safer. And he, half in shock, not yet fully understanding that the woman beside him had tried to burn him alive, had believed her and gone north to the one place he felt safe. He'd been at the cabin 4 days, and he was starting to understand. And what he'd understood, sitting alone in his grandfather's shack, was that if Priscilla ever figured out where he was, she would need to finish what the fire started. Because Daniel alive was the one loose thread that could unravel her completely. He could testify that she built the fraud. He could testify about the insurance policy. He was the only person on earth who could put Priscilla, not Daniel, at the center of everything. He was, in other words, exactly as dangerous to Priscilla as I was. And she had 2 million reasons, and an offshore fortune, and a 2-week head start on a plan to erase every witness. He was, in other words, exactly as dangerous to Priscilla as I was. And she had 2 million reasons, and an offshore fortune, and a 2-week head start on a plan to erase every witness, which meant that getting the evidence wasn't the end. Getting Priscilla was the end. And to get her, I would have to do the one thing my whole career had taught me to do. Read the behavior of a guilty person well enough to predict exactly where they'd go and exactly what they couldn't resist. That night in the cabin, before Frank and Elena came, Daniel and I talked until the propane lamp burned low. I told him what I'd found: the workshop, the notebook in his mother's cedar chest, the 2.1 million, all of it. When I told him the ledger had survived because he'd hidden it in Rosalind's cedar chest, he stared at me, and then he said he'd forgotten he'd even done it. He'd put it there in a panic months before, on pure instinct, following his mother's old rule, without even thinking, and then he'd buried the memory so deep under everything else that he'd assumed it burned with the house. Learning that his mother's hiding place had saved the one piece of evidence that could prove the truth, that Rosalind, 3 years dead, had reached out of the past to protect her son and undo the woman trying to destroy him, undid something in Daniel that I think needed to be undone. He cried for his mother that night, in a way I don't think he'd let himself since the funeral. And then he told me the last piece, the piece that made everything admissible, the piece that ended Priscilla. But I'll get to that in a moment, because it belongs with the reveal. Frank and Elena drove up the next day, and in that fishing cabin we planned the reveal. Elena had, by then, done the careful work. She'd taken the whole package to a state financial crimes prosecutor she trusted, and to a detective in a different jurisdiction than Ramos, one who specialized in exactly this. And the case had landed with the weight it deserved. There were, it turned out, already the quiet beginnings of an investigation into Daniel's firm from the Bishop Trust's side. Our evidence didn't start the fire, so to speak. It poured accelerant on an investigation that had been smoldering. Warrants were being prepared, but warrants need a person to serve, and Priscilla was nowhere. Let me tell you about the last piece, Daniel's piece, because it's what turned a strong case into an airtight one. At the cabin, Daniel said, "Dad, I recorded her," and he took out his phone, the one thing he'd carried out of the fire, the phone that had been in his pocket when he ran, and he played me something. The night before the fire, before he found the insurance policy, Daniel had confronted Priscilla about money going missing. Not the whole thing. He hadn't dared show his full hand, but he'd pushed her about cash flow, about transfers he couldn't account for, the P-solo outflows he'd noticed and written question marks beside. And Priscilla, thinking he was just complaining like always, thinking her husband was the same manageable man he'd always been, had gotten careless, the way she got careless, when she was certain of her own control. And Daniel, who had learned more from watching his father work than either of us ever realized, had quietly started recording on his phone. On that recording, in her own flat, cold voice, Priscilla talked about the offshore accounts. She talked about needing the audit not to find her personal transfers. And when Daniel pushed her, when he asked, "What happens to us if it all comes down?" she said, and Daniel played it for me right there in the cabin, her voice filling the small room. "If it comes down, it comes down on you, sweetheart, not me." I made sure of that a long time ago. She had told him to his face that she'd built him to be the fall guy, and he'd recorded it. And here was the crucial thing. The thing Elena's eyes lit up at when she heard it. Unlike the recordings I'd made in the common areas of my house, whose admissibility might be argued over, this was a conversation Daniel was himself a party to, recorded on his own phone, in a state that permits one-party recording. There was no argument to be had. It was admissible, clean, and devastating. So we had all of it. We had the ledger and the hard drive documenting the fraud. We had my financial records showing Priscilla moving money out of my accounts. We had Frank's tracing of the $2.1 million offshore. We had the insurance policy on Daniel's life, dated 11 days before the fire. We had the fire marshal's finding of 2 points of origin and concentrated accelerant. We had Daniel's eyewitness account of Priscilla, standing dressed by the door, in a smoke-filled house. And now we had Priscilla's own voice, telling my son she'd made him the fall guy. It was the most complete case I'd ever assembled in my life, and I'd assembled it against my own daughter-in-law, to save my own son, built around a notebook that came out of a cedar chest that still smelled like my dead wife. But the case, however airtight, had a hole in the middle of it, and the hole was Priscilla herself. She was in the wind with $2.1 million and a false identity on an offshore account, and every reason to disappear forever. Warrants are just paper until you can put them in someone's hands. We could prove everything she'd done, we just couldn't find her. And so, sitting around that fish-cleaning table with a retired financial crimes investigator, a sharp young lawyer, my broken son, and 40 years of my own experience, reading the behavior of guilty people, we worked out how to make Priscilla come to us. Because I knew the way I know the origin of a fire, that there was one thing Priscilla wanted more than she wanted to disappear, one thing she could not walk away from, and that one thing was going to be her leash. The one thing was this: she needed to know, for certain, whether Daniel was alive or dead. Think about her position. A dead Daniel meant $2 million in life insurance she could eventually collect. And, more importantly, no living witness who could put the fraud on her. A living Daniel meant catastrophe. A man who knew everything, who could testify that the scheme was hers, who could lead investigators to her offshore accounts. Until she knew which one she was dealing with, Priscilla could not act. She couldn't file the insurance claim, because filing a claim on a man who turned out to be alive would be its own kind of confession. She couldn't fully relax and vanish, because if Daniel was alive and talking, disappearing wouldn't save her. Her whole future forked on that single unknown, and she had no way to resolve it, because Daniel had vanished as completely as she had. Her greatest strengths, her patience, her planning, her control, had all depended on knowing more than everyone around her. And now, for the first time, she was the one in the dark. She didn't know if her husband was alive. And a person like Priscilla cannot tolerate not knowing the one fact on which everything depends. She would have to come find out. All we had to do was give her a place and a time to come to. So we were going to tell her Daniel was alive, and we were going to tell her exactly where he'd be. Here was the plan. The Bishop Family Trust was holding its long-scheduled audit review. The deadline, the thing Priscilla had feared above all, at a large accounting firm's offices downtown, a formal proceeding with the trust's principals, their attorneys, forensic accountants, and, because the fraud had by now been reported. Investigators. It was, in effect, the courtroom of this whole story, even if it was a conference room. Every party Priscilla had wronged, and every authority who could arrest her, would be in one place on one morning, and we were going to make sure Priscilla believed she needed to be there too. The bait was simple, and it was true, which is why it worked. Through channels, a message Daniel sent to an associate he knew Priscilla still monitored, worded exactly as we needed. Word reached Priscilla that Daniel was alive, that he had surfaced, and that he was planning to walk into the Bishop audit and hand over everything, including a second ledger and a recording, in exchange for a cooperation deal. That he was going to name her that morning, at that address. For Priscilla, this was the end of the world and the last window to stop it. If Daniel walked into that room, she was finished. She could not let him get there. And she could not simply run, because she didn't yet know how much he had, or whether cooperating would send investigators straight to her offshore accounts. She needed to intercept, to see for herself, to manage it, the way she'd managed everything, the way she'd managed me, across a breakfast table for months. She came. I was there. Against Frank's advice and Elena's, and my own good sense, I was in that building on the morning of the reveal, because I was not going to hear about the end of this story, second-hand in a parking lot from a tired detective. I had earned the right to read this burn myself, in person, to the end. The audit was underway in a large glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor. The Bishop Trust's principals sat along one side. An older woman named Margaret Bishop Hale, who ran the family fund, and who, I would learn, had lost a good portion of her late husband's legacy and several employees' pensions into Daniel's fraud. Forensic accountants, the trust's attorneys, Elena, representing me, and, in a careful, limited way, cooperating on Daniel's behalf. And, in plain clothes, positioned quietly, 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit and a detective who had spent the last 48 hours confirming every single thing in our package and finding it, to her professional astonishment, completely solid. Daniel was not in the room. That was the trap. Priscilla was told he'd be there. He wasn't. He was in a secure office down the hall, with an investigator, ready to be brought in only after she'd committed herself. Because we needed Priscilla to arrive, believing she was walking in to stop Daniel, and we needed her to act, in front of everyone, before she realized the room already knew who she was. She walked in at 9:40 in the morning. I will remember it as long as I live. The glass door opened and Priscilla came through it in a charcoal suit, composed, chin up, playing the part she'd played her whole life. The wronged, worried wife. Here, out of concern. Here, to help make sense of her missing husband's terrible business. She'd built a story on the drive over. I could see it in her face. And the story was, I am a victim too. I knew nothing. My husband and his poor confused father did this, and I am here to cooperate. She scanned the room for Daniel, and in the half-second when she didn't find him, when her careful face flickered with the first hairline crack of confusion, that was the moment I stood up. I had been sitting at the end of the table, and I'd worn, deliberately, the same worn cardigan and the same slightly lost expression I'd worn across the breakfast table for months. And when Priscilla's eyes found me instead of Daniel, I watched her do the arithmetic she'd done the first day she met me. Old, slow, harmless. Confused Nathaniel, who couldn't find his glasses. She actually relaxed a little. She thought, I could see her think it, that whatever this was, it was something she could manage, because the only Reyes in the room was the one she'd already decided didn't count. She said, Nathaniel, her voice pitched to soft concern, for the audience. Thank God you're all right. I've been frantic. Where is Daniel? Is he all right? And I sat down, on the polished conference table, the second ledger, Daniel's spiral notebook, and beside it, my old laptop, already open, Already cued, I said quietly, in a voice that was not confused at all. Hello, Priscilla. I found it. I found the second ledger. It was in Rosalind's cedar chest, where Daniel hid it, where his mother taught him to hide things, in her own things, because no one looks through a mother's belongings. You never found it, because you never knew it existed. But I did. I've read every page. I have spent 40 years watching the exact moment a person realizes the fire has been read. It's a specific thing that happens in the face. The performance stops, the calculation stops, and underneath, for just an instant, you see the real person, cornered, doing math that no longer adds up. Priscilla's face did that. She recovered fast. She was, I'll grant her, the most capable liar I ever encountered. She said brightly, to the room, I don't know what he's talking about. He's not well. His son and I have been so worried about his memory. And I pressed the key on the laptop. Her own voice filled the glass room. From Daniel's phone, the night before the fire, crisp and cold, and unmistakably her. If it comes down on you, sweetheart, not me. I made sure of that a long time ago. The room went silent. Margaret Bishop Hale's head came up sharply. The forensic accountants stopped moving, and Priscilla's brightness curdled, and for the first time since I'd known her, she had nothing to say, because the voice on the recording was hers, and there was no version of the worried innocent wife story that survived it. That was when the detective stood up and identified herself and said the words I had waited weeks to hear. Priscilla, there was a fire in that farmhouse, and through the glass wall, coming down the hall toward the room, flanked by an investigator, was Daniel, alive, walking in exactly as she'd been told he would, but an hour and a lifetime too late for her to stop it. Priscilla saw her husband alive through the glass, and I watched $2 million of insurance and a clean escape, and a lifetime of careful lies, all die in her eyes at once. She ran. Of course she ran. She turned for the door, and the two financial crimes investigators who'd been standing so quietly by the wall were there before she took 3 steps, and it was over in the undignified, ordinary way these things actually end. Not with a scream, but with a woman in a charcoal suit being told to put her hands behind her back in a conference room on the 14th floor, while forensic accountants looked at their shoes. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because the videos on this channel are about real feeling, not cheap revenge. What I felt, watching Priscilla be let out, was tired and sad, and, underneath it, something quieter and steadier that I can only call restored. The old lion doesn't roar when it's over. It just stops having to hide. Then Daniel came through the door, and my son and I stood in that room full of the people his crimes had hurt, and I did not know yet what would happen to him, and it didn't matter in that first moment, because he was alive, and he came to me, and put his head down on my shoulder like he was 6 years old, and I held my boy up, and I was 71, and I had walked into fire and read every page, and I had not lost him after all. Let me tell you how it ended for each of them. Because you deserve the specific accounting. That's the promise of this channel. Not vague justice, but the real numbers. Priscilla was charged first with what they could prove fastest, and hold her on. And then, as Frank's tracing and the ledger, and the Bishop Trust's records were fully unpacked, with the full weight of it. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. And, once the fire marshal's 2 points of origin finding was joined to the insurance policy she'd taken on Daniel, and to Daniel's own testimony, arson and attempted murder, 2 counts, 1 for Daniel, 1 for me. Her trial took place the following spring, almost exactly a year after the fire, and I sat through every day of it. I owed it to Rosalind's memory, and to Daniel, and to myself, to be in that room and watch the truth get read into the record, the way I'd read it out of the ash. Priscilla hired good lawyers. She still had money the investigators hadn't found. I suspect she always will have. And they fought hard. And they tried, exactly as I'd predicted a skeptical detective would, to paint me as a confused old man whose recordings couldn't be trusted, and whose story was the grief-addled invention of a lonely widower. It didn't work, and I'll tell you why it didn't work. Because I had spent 40 years being cross-examined by defense attorneys who wanted to make the fire investigator look uncertain, and I knew exactly how to sit in that chair. When Priscilla's lawyer asked me, in a tone dripping with false gentleness, whether it was possible I'd simply misremembered, misunderstood, imagined the whole thing given my age and my loss, I looked at him, and I said, calmly, that I had spent 38 years reading the origins of fires for the state, that I had testified in more courtrooms than he had likely tried cases in, that the farmhouse had 2 independent points of origin and concentrated accelerant at the base of the only staircase, and that there is no version of grief or age that puts a second fire in a second room by accident. And then I said that the recordings could be doubted, perhaps, but the insurance policy on my son's life, dated 11 days before someone tried to burn him alive, was not a memory. It was a document, with her signature on it. The jury watched Priscilla's face while I said it. I've learned to watch juries. They were done with her before I left the stand. Frank's tracing of the offshore money held up completely. The $2.1 million, all of it, was identified and frozen through the cooperation of the institutions he'd tracked it to. It took 19 months of legal work by Elena and the prosecutor's office, but the bulk of it was recovered. The forensic accountants walked the jury through the shell companies, through Meridian Vale and its 4 siblings, through the fabricated leases and the circling money, until even the jurors who'd looked lost on the first day understood exactly what had been built and exactly who had built it. And Daniel's recording, Priscilla's own voice saying it comes down on you, sweetheart, not me, I made sure of that a long time ago, was played in that courtroom, and I watched 12 people understand, all at once, precisely what kind of woman had married into my family. Priscilla was convicted on every count. She was sentenced to 24 years. She will be in her 70s when she leaves prison, if she leaves it at all. Roughly the age I was, when she decided I was too old and too slow to matter. I was in the room when the sentence was read. She did not look at me. But I looked at her, once, steadily, the way you look at a fire that's finally out. And then I looked away, and I never thought about her face again. Daniel was the harder story, and I won't pretend otherwise, because pretending would insult you. My son committed real crimes. He helped build the fraud. Money that belonged to retirees and to Margaret Bishop Hale's family went into projects he knew were lies. That is true, and no father's love changes it, and I did not ask anyone to pretend it away. But Daniel cooperated fully, and his cooperation, the ledger he'd kept, the recording he'd made, his willingness to testify against Priscilla and to walk investigators through every account and every shell company, was the single thing that made recovering the money possible and made Priscilla's conviction certain. The prosecutor, and to her great credit, Margaret Bishop Hale herself, recognized that Daniel had been both a perpetrator and, at the end, a victim, marked for death by the true architect of the scheme. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 6 years, of which, with his cooperation and the nature of his role, he was expected to serve considerably less. He did not fight the sentence. He told the judge he deserved it, and I believe he meant it. And that was the first thing in a long time that made me believe my son might actually come back to himself. The $400,000 I'd loaned him was, in the end, recovered as part of the larger clawback, though I'll tell you plainly that getting it back was never the point, and it never once felt like a victory. The Bishop Family Trust recovered, over the course of that first year and the next, a little more than $7 of its $9 million, the the frozen offshore funds, the clawed-back transfers, the assets seized. Not everything. Fraud always leaves a hole that can't be fully filled. But enough that the pensions Margaret had feared were lost were, in large part, made whole. And she told me once, when it was over, that she had come into that conference room, expecting to bury her husband's legacy, and had instead watched an old man in a cardigan hand her back most of it. She said it kindly. I've thought about it often. 6 months after the trial, I did the thing I want to end on, the thing that matters most. I did not rebuild the farmhouse. I couldn't. Rosalind was in every board of it, and watching it burn had been like watching her die twice, and some places are meant to stay as memory. I sold the 11 acres to a young family, with 2 small children and a dog, and I told them about the oak Rosalind, and I planted the year Daniel was born, and I made them promise to leave it standing, and they did, and with a portion of what was recovered, my recovered savings, and a contribution the Bishop Trust insisted on making, and money I'd have given anyway, I established something in Rosalind's name. Rosalind was a chemistry teacher for 31 years. She spent her life turning restless, underestimated teenagers into people who mattered. She used to come home from school and tell me about them at dinner. The boy everyone had given up on, who'd finally understood a chemical equation and lit up like she'd handed him the world. The girl the other teachers called a lost cause, who Rosalind had quietly decided was the smartest student she'd ever taught. Rosalind's whole gift was seeing the value in people other people had written off. She saw it in her students for 3 decades. And, I think now, she saw it in Daniel to the very end. And she saw it in me, and hiding her son away to save himself in her own cedar chest was the last time her gift reached out of the past and did its work. So I funded the Rosalind Reyes Memorial Scholarship at the high school where she taught, for students going into the sciences, and, specifically, for the kind of kid she loved best, the ones everyone else had written off, the clever, restless ones, who just needed one adult to take them seriously. I endowed it with enough that it will outlive me by a great many years. Every year it sends 2 of them to college. There's a small plaque in the school's science hallway with her name on it, and a line I chose, from something she used to say to her students on the first day of every year. Nobody is a lost cause. Some people are just waiting to be seen. The first year, one of the recipients was a girl who wanted to study forensic chemistry and fire. Her mother's field and mine joined in one 17-year-old somebody else had nearly given up on. She wrote me a letter. I keep it in the workshop, taped to the wall, next to Rosalind's old notes. I still have the workshop. I moved a cot out there, and then I moved the rest of my life out there. And it's small, and it smells like machine oil, and cedar, and it is, somehow, more of a home than the big house ever was. My son writes to me every week from where he is, and I write back, and when he comes home there will be a place for him, and a lot of hard work to become the man his mother believed he could be, and I intend to be alive to see him try. People ask me, sometimes, when they hear the story, how I did it, how a 71-year-old man saw through a scheme that fooled a $9 million investment fund, survived a fire meant to kill him, found evidence hidden in his dead wife's belongings, and brought down the person who did it, all while everyone around him, the detective, the daughter-in-law, even his own son, believed he was just a confused old man who'd lost the thread. And I tell them the truth, which is the only lesson I have to offer, the one Rosalind knew, and the one my whole career taught me. They tell you that when you get old, you stop mattering, that you go slow and gray and easy to step over, and that the people who love you will start managing you, and the people who don't will start circling. And a lot of us believe it, and go quiet, and let ourselves be stepped over. But there is another kind of old. An old lion doesn't chase. He doesn't roar at every noise in the grass. He lies still, and gray, and patient, and he lets the whole savannah decide he's finished. He lets them get close. He lets them get comfortable. He lets them believe, right up until the last possible second, that the old thing in the grass can't hurt them anymore. And then, when they've forgotten to be afraid, he reminds them why they should have been. I spent 40 years learning to read fire, to walk into the worst thing that ever happened to someone and find the truth in the ash, no matter how well it was hidden. They thought that made me old. It made me dangerous. It just took them setting my whole life on fire to find out. My name is Nathaniel Reyes. They underestimated the old lion. They usually do. That's the story. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever been the one everybody underestimated, and what happened when they found out they were wrong. If this story meant something to you, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, where we tell one honest tale at a time about the people who've earned the right to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.